Hello, welcome back. It's Christopher Taylor with Sovereign Harmony. Glad to have you back again. So today is Sunday, November 10th. I'm coming to check in here, probably the last check-in before I do my 2025 year ahead here in a few weeks, really. Now that we're almost halfway through November. So I'll probably do that one by January 1st anyway, at least before then. But I want to check in here. Got a couple of big shifts happening as we speak, including a Mercury retrograde. So you can see on my screen here, first thing we got coming up is Saturn going direct on Friday with the full moon in Taurus. So we'll talk about that. Pluto entering Aquarius. We've been talking about that for a few years now. It's been in and out of Aquarius, but it'll finally leave Capricorn for good here on the 19th. And so we'll talk about the next 20 years and what that entails, etc. Then Mercury goes retrograde. So starting November 25th, a few days before Thanksgiving, it'll retrograde all the way till December 15th. You see that here. And in the middle of that Mercury retrograde, Mars will actually go retrograde. And if you're not familiar, that only happens about once every 25 months. So about every 2 years or so, Mars retrogrades, just like Mercury, but it lasts a lot longer. That's going to retrograde. And it starts in December, but it's going to last into late February. And that's going to have some implications as well. And that's going to happen within a day of Neptune turning direct in Pisces. And before we start, if you haven't already, subscribe, like, feel free to comment on anything that you get out of this, or that if you want to add something to this. Also, share it with people you know. If you think this is good information for you, other people might think so too. And so the shadow for this retrograde actually just started, like I said, today's the 10th, so 3 days ago on the 7th, that's when Mercury entered the zone. So literally 2 days after the US presidential election, which we will touch on. In my last video, I did say don't attach yourself to the winner too much, because there's two different paths to the same destination, essentially is what's happening. So we're going to be on a certain path, but there may be some things in the way of that path anyway that I will talk about. So getting started here. So starting with our first situation, Saturn turning direct at 12 degrees Pisces. So here is the chart for the full moon on that same day on the 15th, this Friday coming up. So that moon is going to be tightly conjunct with the planet Uranus in Taurus. It'll be highlighting Pluto and Neptune as well. And so if you remember from my last video, I talked about how all three outer planets forming this kind of triangle with each other, right? And so this full moon is going to highlight that triangle. And then as soon as Pluto, which is at the very end of Capricorn here on the 15th, it's 4 days away from entering Aquarius on the 19th, it's the last time that can really happen. So it's going to kind of break up. That triangle breaks up essentially as Pluto exits Capricorn, enters Aquarius. But that is going to be highlighted here. So there's a lot of far-reaching implications when we're talking about outer planets. It's more about collective evolution and things of that nature rather than personal. Okay, but there is Saturn right there. It will be going direct at right around 12, 13 degrees or so in Pisces. And so when Saturn goes direct in Pisces, it can be a time, both in our lives and collectively, where like chickens come home to roost, essentially. So if there have been any sort of deceptions, whether it was deceiving ourselves or deceiving others, there has a tendency for the truth to kind of come out. Think of Saturn as like justice. And when there's lies, the way that's justified is when the truth comes out, okay? So you don't think of Saturn with truth, generally speaking, but when it's in Pisces, because of the deception aspect of Pisces, Saturn can really be kind of like a truth revealer, like a fact check, for example. That's a kind of energy that Saturn and Pisces can have when it moves direct, okay? So that is coming up this Friday. One thing I want to note, like I said, we just had this election, that in the orange man's chart, this full moon and Uranus is sitting up there at the top of his chart right now, right on his midheaven. Okay, so that midheaven is this point right here. It's where we're most visible. Okay, and when the first attempt on his life happened in Pennsylvania, there was some things going on there. I think I talked about that in my last video. There were some planetary aspects highlighting this position. There's also an asteroid there called Algol, okay, which is associated with death of leaders and things like that. And so the fact that that attempt happened when that was highlighted was interesting astrologically anyway. But this full moon coming up brings that up again. So what do I think is going to happen? I wouldn't be surprised if there was another attempt on his life later this week. Whether or not it's successful, different story. But I wouldn't be surprised. I'm not predicting that it will happen, but I would the least surprised person around if it does. Okay. And the reason why I'm thinking this way too, it's been awful quiet on the other side, essentially, since that happened, as if there's something up their sleeve, like that there's something that's going to go down. There's other things that can go down, which I'll get into when we talk about Mercury retrograde in that situation. But anyway, be aware, some surprising things could be in the air collectively, with Saturn turning direct in Pisces. Like I said, that like some things that were deceptive, suddenly the doors open to the truth here over the coming weeks. And this could be, the Uranian aspect to this full moon could be part of it, the start of that, the ignition of that kind of curtain being, pulled open, essentially. So keep that in mind for the end of this week coming up. And again, like I mentioned, there's Pluto just about to break up that triangle by entering Aquarius. So Pluto's going to enter Aquarius just 4 days later. So on Tuesday, the 19th, and there it is at 000 Aquarius, where it will be in this sign literally until 2044. So the next 20 years of your life and my life and everyone's lives, we're going to have Pluto in Aquarius. And of course, it's been flirting with Aquarius for the last year and a half or so. It's been in and out a few times. And so it's kind of got its feet wet a little bit, and now it's ready for the full dive. And some of the things that we're, likely to see over the next 20 years, lots of, massive transformations, technologically speaking, are a big part of Aquarian energy. We're talking about technology. Probably going to look at, especially when it comes to AI, but there could also be like medical breakthroughs, things of that nature. So it's a new dawn in a lot of ways with Pluto entering Aquarius. And so with Pluto in Capricorn the last 16 years, going back to 2008, I've talked about it extensively in many videos. But just as that reminder, Capricorn is like governance, corporations, like large, influential entities, okay? And that top-down power with Pluto in there. And so it's been a time of we've had some tyrannical run-ins over this period, including obviously the chess cold and the response to it, and what, all the lockdowns and things like that. So that's, one example out of many, but there's essentially a lot of behind the scenes actions of people in power that have been present for the last 16 years. And that presence essentially is lifting. Okay. And so Pluto in Aquarius is a lot lighter in that sense. And Aquarius rules the people, right? So we're taking away the power from the large organizations, government, corporations, whatever, and putting it back into the individuals. Okay. So a lot of people think this signifies the Aquarian age, dawning, essentially. I feel like, these ages between, the signs, whatever, there's a blend. I don't think it happened overnight. It was one thing, because we had some outer planets go through Aquarius semi-recently. And that would have been, I think Neptune was in Aquarius in the late 90s with Uranus, actually. I think they were there pretty close to the same time, if I'm remembering right, like late 90s into the early 2000s. So you could suggest that that's when the internet was basically coming online and becoming a part of everybody's everyday life, right? And now what happens when Pluto goes through there, right? It kind of ups the ante. And that's why I bring up things like artificial intelligence. There could be disclosure when it comes to like aliens and extraterrestrial activity, etc. So it could be a really opening sort of period for everyone, and just in general, it'd be interesting to see how how we govern ourselves under this umbrella of Pluto and Aquarius. I think we kind of had a look while Pluto was in Capricorn, what happens, or how power hungry some people can be, and what happens if we give our power away to that. Okay, and so there's a sense of, again, coming back to the people, etc. So we could talk about that all day long, but I'm going to move on. But this is a big move, Pluto moving into Aquarius. So I mean, like I said, the last time we had Pluto really change signs was in 2008. So it has been a while. Okay, so next on the list is the Mercury retrograde coming up. It's going to retrograde entirely in the sign of Sagittarius. It's like I said, it's already entered the shadow period. In other words, it's already past 6 degrees Sagittarius, where it will turn direct in the middle of December. But for now, talk about the retrograde. So November 25th, it's just a few days before Thanksgiving in the U.S. So that's Mercury right there. And I just highlighted some of the planets that it will be aspecting along its journey. Okay. And a couple of these two aspects, actually, Jupiter in Gemini, sextiling Chiron in Aries, and then Jupiter in Gemini squaring Saturn in Pisces. Those are two aspects that started September-ish, a couple months ago, and they're going to be ongoing into the spring, into like May or so. Okay. So we're in the midst of that. It's interesting to note that Mercury in its retrograde will be highlighting all of those. It's going to form a square to Saturn in Pisces. It's going to form a trine to Chiron in Aries, and it's going to oppose Jupiter in Gemini. So those three are kind of ongoing for the next couple of months. Really November, December timeframe is when this energy is active, essentially. So I think what happens with Mercury and Sagittarius, especially in the U.S. post-election, etc., Sagittarius it rules the media, essentially. Okay, it's the large-scale communications of all kinds, and I mean, the media got this thing really wrong. Okay, in terms of the election, and it's just I feel like there's going to be a lot of scrambling with Mercury retrograding. It is a time of introspection and going within on a personal level, but on that collective level, as far as the media goes, there could be a sense of scrambling to figure out where do we go from here. Like there's a massive loss of trust in the media as it is, okay, over the last 20 years or so. And so this is only going to make it worse. People that just tune in and they're getting a sense of reassurance that the person they want is going to win, and the whole time we've been told that it's basically neck and neck, and it's a tie. And it's interesting that I just watching a couple of videos of people looking at 2016, 2020, like what the polls said versus what the results were. And in both cases, there was this almost same amount of drift. Like there was a lot of overestimating against the Orange Man, essentially in the polls. And then in reality, it was closer for him. And in those polls in the 2016, 2020 leading up to those elections, there were large leads in the polls against him. Okay. And in this one, it was neck and neck. But it doesn't take a genius to just use the logic to say, like, if the polls tend in the last two elections, they've tended about the same amount of points difference, that maybe that's going to happen again, right? And then so these, a couple of videos I watched, they're just doing the math. It's just logic. It's just, high value information because it's data, right? We can't assume that 2024 is going to come out exactly the way that 2016 and 2020 did, but it's not the worst speculation to suggest that the same error bar is going to exist. So in that sense, it would be a landslide for him. And that's what happened. So essentially, just people who aren't even professionals, just looking at numbers, letting the numbers tell the story, versus the media, who is dead set on convincing you that there is a chance here, even though they probably already knew there wasn't. Okay, and like I said, it doesn't matter who essentially wins it. Just it's two different paths to the same destination. Okay, so now we're on this path, assuming it continues. If later this week, he survives another attempt, or if something, happens, who knows? But also, or I think the same week that Mercury goes retrograde here, I think it's the 25th or 26th, the state of New York has it's the next phase in their case against him. And so that could have some repercussions, who knows? Especially with Mercury turning retrograde right at that point. There can be a lot of, again, that scrambling. Maybe that's the media's next big story is, how can he be president, blah, blah, And so we'll have to wait and see how that pans out. But I expect the period from just before Thanksgiving to just before Christmas to be, one of the media scrambling and people on an individual level kind of questioning authority a little bit, questioning can I trust the information that I'm getting? Can I trust what I think, what my instincts think? And there's a sort of healing going on as well on an individual level with Chiron and Aries. So there's a sense of like coming to grips with the idea that maybe we can trust ourselves. Maybe what our gut tells us is right, and it doesn't matter if it's coming at us from a news article or news on TV or whatever. That we can have our own discernment and saying, I don't think that's right. So that was kind of like what I was doing, when I was looking at those polls and thinking, I think this could be a landslide. Like if the math just does the same thing it did the last two times, then it is. And why wouldn't that be mentioned on what's supposed to be a professional news outlet? Wouldn't they be sharing that kind of information? Where was it? They obviously had it, right? If I came across it, pretty simply, I'm sure it was well known that this is the result that happened was a likely one, and they didn't portray it in that manner. So this brings up the square to Saturn that's going to be happening over the coming weeks. Again, that's kind of goes in line with Saturn turning direct in Pisces and that truth coming out. Okay, things that have been held back, any kind of deceptions being made more clear. Okay, and so there is a sense of like kind of almost bitterness and again even more trust being diminished in terms of higher level entities. And with Pluto entering Aquarius, here we go. We're bringing the power back to the people right at the same time, right? So there is a sense that like I think there's like a 100th monkey effect where enough people are now awake to the idea that like, we can't trust what's coming out of those entities anymore. And so the beginning of the end of mainstream media, as we know, and I've mentioned that in a few videos before, and that has a lot to do with when it's going to be Saturn and Neptune. When Saturn catches up with Neptune here, and they cross the threshold from Pisces to Aries, I'm actually going to be doing a talk for the San Diego Astrological Society. They do I think it's the second Friday of every month. They do a meeting. So I'm scheduled for April. I'm going to be talking all about Saturn, Neptune, that cycle itself, what I see in terms of the end of mainstream media and the birth, essentially, of alternative media being the cornerstone and core of where people get their information. We're already at the precipice, and I think this election might be, again, the beginning of that rock starting to roll down the hill. Okay, and by the time we get to 2025, 2026, because that conjunction will happen in the spring of 2026, but they're both going to be kind of back and forth and in that vicinity starting in the spring of 2025 when I'll be giving this talk in April. So it's going to be a 1 year period starting around then. And I think we're really going to see the unraveling of the structure that is, the structure of the mainstream media and how information is shared to the public going forward. So this will be the beginning rumblings of it, Mercury in retrograde. So it's okay to question what we believe right now. That's really a big part of this Mercury retrograde. Don't be afraid to question it. Don't be afraid to trust yourself. Okay, that's all I'll say there. Anyway, so like I said, in between Mercury turning retrograde on November 25th and then turning direct on the 15th, we have Mars turning retrograde in Leo, 6 degrees, and the next day on the 7th, Neptune will turn direct in Pisces. So we have Saturn direct in Pisces, November 15th, and about 3 weeks later, Neptune turns direct in Pisces. So both, again, having to do, remember, these are the two planets that we're talking about that are going to meet up and cross over into Aries. And, the Aries point is the start of the zodiac. And so it doesn't surprise me what I'm saying here, that's the kind of rhythm we're in, where both of those planets are turning direct in relatively the same time frame. And they're about to move in lockstep toward this new beginning when it comes to media. Okay, so that chart for Mars turning retrograde looks like this. There's Mars right there, 6 degrees Leo. And these are the planets it will be aspecting as well. And notice that it, just like this full moon coming up on Friday the 15th, this, Mars turning retrograde at 6 degrees Leo on December 6th highlights those same outer planets. And then also Chiron. Okay. So this has, again, far-reaching, more universal influence, not necessarily personal. Okay, but on a personal level, when Mars goes retrograde, Mars is the planet of action. It's, how we move forward. And Mars retrograde is the opposite of moving forward, right? And so Leo, where it is now, it's very bold and proud, and there's a sense that like it can be done. If I want it done, it can be done, a real sense of confidence. And that's going to pull back and all the way, almost halfway through Cancer, back to 17 degrees Cancer. And it's not going to go direct until late February, like I said before. So it's a introspective period, and then it starts during a Mercury retrograde. Is for at least a couple of weeks. There's that double whammy effect of Mercury and Mars retrograde at the same time. For about 9 days from December 6th when Mars goes retrograde until December 15th when Mercury goes direct. There's going to be both of them in retrograde. So there's mental introspection and questioning what we believe. There's also this sense of physically pulling back from what we're doing, from projects that we just need to take a break from, or have to really reassess. That's really what it is. We have these projects in mind, but we really have to think about and plan and strategize how we want to go forward with it. And this is almost like going into hibernation. From Leo back to Cancer is very much a feisty energy, going back to a softer, more nurturing energy. And so you can think of it like that. We're kind of at a point where we know what we want to create, we know what direction we want to go, but there's a sense that we have to pull back and nurture it a little bit and make it its best, the best that it can be before moving forward with it. So that's on a more personal level. On a collective level, because it is aspecting these outer planets and Chiron. Again, it's got the far-reaching influence that's more universal than it is personal. So one of these aspects it's making is that opposition to Pluto. So it already opposed Pluto at 29 degrees of Cancer when Pluto is at 29 degrees Capricorn. And they're going to oppose each other a couple more times. I think the last one is actually like in June, I believe. So it's going to be a while, well into 2025. But both of those oppositions, when they happen, Pluto, like we said, Pluto's in Aquarius now, so it's going to be Mars and Leo opposing Pluto and Aquarius rather than Mars and Cancer opposing Pluto and Capricorn. Okay, and so there is a sense of major transformations. And so that's part of why we want to pull back what our plans are, because they're in the midst of transformation. And so we don't want them out prematurely. We want to make sure they're nurtured and able to grow into what they're supposed to be before we move forward, right? And it's also going to aspect Neptune and Uranus when it gets back into Cancer. It'll be forming those aspects with those planets in the late degrees, so that it sort of almost re-energizes that triangle. So the triangle that was between Pluto, Neptune, and Uranus in the late degrees of their signs. Now all of a sudden you go to Mars, which would be in Cancer at that time when it's retrograding, and it's going to kind of reignite that from the other side, that triangle. Okay, so there is a sense of kind of permanent change. Is really that's the phrase that just came through. Is that the way things have been, they're not going to be anymore. Okay, so on a collective level, there is a sense of major transformations that close the door on the past in a very definitive manner. Okay, so we're closing the door on the past. We're going ahead to the future. Things a year from now are going to look very different. We'll be surprised how we ever, thought one way long ago, a year ago. We'll wonder how we ever thought that way, how we ever saw things the way we saw them, because we're going to be really enlightened as to what has been going on. But that is ending. Like we won't know what has been going on until it's over, right? That's the energy that I get out of that. And so the last thing that we'll talk about this time around, so there's that Jupiter sextile to Chiron I mentioned when I talked about Mercury going retrograde, and that Jupiter square Saturn. They're ongoing again until the spring. So, but they are part of this Mercury retrograde. If this will click for me. Hello. All right. Don't want to move. Anyway, doesn't matter. We saw the Mercury retrograde chart, and it was aspecting, again, Jupiter, Chiron, and Saturn. And again, that has a lot to do with, again, questioning what we believe. So by the time we get to mid-December, that is a big part of it. We're going to be a little more clear on what it is that we believe, who we trust to get our information, and how we process information. And it's a new era with Pluto and Aquarius. It's have both Saturn and Neptune direct in Pisces, so there's a lot more clarity that it goes along with the introspection, figuring out what we're going to do, and that's going to really just help us out with this Mars retrograde, where we're pulling back, making sure things are good to go all the way. So I'm going to wrap it up there. I don't want to go too long, but that's the energy we got for the next couple months, November into December. Feel free to comment, like I said, like, share, subscribe, and I will be back probably just before the new year to talk about 2025 in more depth. So thanks for watching. Thanks for sharing, and we'll see you again later.